Joining me now to respond to that is Senator Chris Coons, a close ally of President Biden. Good morning, Senator. You know, those voters in Texas can resubmit the ballot applications, but you heard the election officials saying this is a canary in the coal mine for the midterms. How concerned are you?
I'm gravely concerned, Martha. We're seeing laws like SB 1 in Texas passed in a dozen states across the country that are clearly designed to accomplish voter suppression. There are legitimate concerns about making sure there isn't widespread voter fraud. There isn't. We've investigated it repeatedly in the Congress. And under that veil, that somehow requiring people to remember exactly what form of ID they used to register years ago, mail-in ballot requests can be invalidated, as your reporting just showed in Harris County, Texas. I'm concerned that similar tricks and moves are being used at the local level to suppress the vote and to make it harder for working people, for seniors, for those who are medically vulnerable during a pandemic to vote.
You know, neither Senator Kyrsten Sinema nor Senator Joe Manchin supported changing the Senate filibuster rules to get voting rights passed nationally. Now the Arizona Democratic Party has censured Senator Sinema over this. Is that really appropriate? Is that helpful?
Well, Martha, what I hope your viewers get about what happened this last week in the Senate is that all 50 Democrats, including Senators Manchin and Sinema, voted for the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act and for the Freedom to Vote Act, which would tackle this problem of voter suppression and voter subversion around the country, and none of the 50 Republicans in the Senate joined us. There are frustrations, of course, in the Democratic Party across the country, but the right to vote is foundational. It's not just foundational to the Democratic Party. It's one of the foundations of our democracy. We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep working at it. This was an important fight for us to show that sharp contrast between Democrats and Republicans this last week on the floor of the Senate. But more importantly, we need to keep working to make sure that every American can vote and vote safely and vote securely.
Have you really seen evidence of suppression? As I said in Harris County, for instance, they can resubmit that application.
Absolutely. We've seen abundant evidence that there are laws being passed that roll back things like ballot drop boxes, drive-through voting, 24-hour early voting, restricting access to the ballot box, particularly for those who in an ongoing pandemic are medically vulnerable, those who are essential workers. We made significant progress in making it easier for folks to vote in the pandemic in 2020. Why would we be rolling that back in a dozen states when the pandemic isn't over? And why would we be erecting new barriers for people to be able to vote? We've seen cleverly crafted laws that will do things like automatically remove people from the voting rolls or make it harder for them to apply for mail-in ballots that I believe are designed to suppress the vote.
And Senator Coons, I want to turn to President Biden. Democrats have been united against former President Trump's efforts to cast doubt on the last election. But in his press conference, President Biden cast some doubt of his own about the next one. Let's listen.
All depends on whether or not we're able to make the case to the American people that some of this is being set up to try to alter the outcome of the election.
He tried to walk that back, but was the damage done?
Well, Martha, what you're hearing there is President Biden's passionate commitment to making sure that we are pushing back on voter suppression and that we secure access to the ballot for as many Americans as is possible. That's something I'm also passionately committed to. And we need to make it clear to the American people what's at stake here and why we're fighting so hard to secure the right to vote.
And Senator Coons, you are a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. I want to turn to Russia and Ukraine. The State Department is preparing to approve the evacuation of some U.S. diplomats and their families. How likely do you think this morning, as we sit here, an invasion is likely?
Well, the most important thing that President Biden has been doing is to deter Putin from invading Ukraine. He has pulled together our NATO allies. In sharp contrast to his predecessor, he's invested time and effort in rebuilding our European partnerships, our North Atlantic Alliance. $650 million in military assistance was delivered to Ukraine in the past year, and just this week, another $200 million in ammunition and small arms and Javelin missiles and Stinger missiles are being delivered. And our close NATO allies like the United Kingdom, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France are delivering material as well. I think our work in the Senate and President Biden's work to strengthen deterrence is what is hopefully going to succeed. But I am gravely concerned that Putin will show once again aggression in Europe and cross the boundary into Ukraine in the coming days or weeks.
And Senator Coons, you sponsored legislation supported by the White House to impose those crippling sanctions if Russia invades. My next guest, Senator Joni Ernst, said sanctions should come now. Why not now?
I do think we should take up and pass a bipartisan bill that will show resolve and determination and apply some sanctions now. But the very strongest sanctions, the sorts of sanctions that we use to bring Iran to the table, is something that we should hold out as a deterrent to prevent Putin from taking the last step of invading Ukraine.
And Senator Coons, just quickly, if you will, there's a report out this morning that British intelligence believes that the Russians plan to oust Ukraine's President Zelensky and install a pro-Moscow government. What do you know about that?
Well, I've also heard those press reports. One of the things that we are doing to show resolve and bipartisan determination is engagement with Zelensky to support him. 20 members of the Senate and the House, Democrats and Republicans, spent 2 hours on a Zoom call with Zelensky on Christmas Eve, and a bipartisan group just went to Kyiv to meet with him in Ukraine this past week. I think it's important that we continue to show support for the duly elected leadership of Ukraine, and that the United Kingdom and the United States, that our intelligence communities call out in advance things that we are learning Russia is planning, to make it clear to the rest of Europe just how aggressive and just how creative Putin intends to be in both overt and covert means in trying to overthrow Ukraine's government, its independence, and to violate its sovereignty.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us this morning, Senator. Let's get a response from Senator Joni Ernst, Vice Chair of the Senate GOP Conference and a member of the Armed Services Committee. Good morning, Senator Ernst. What's the likelihood you see of a Russian invasion at this point, and why should Americans be worried about that?
Well, we need to be strong as America, and what we see with Russia amassing troops and equipment at the Ukrainian border is indicative of some sort of action. What that will transpire into is yet to be seen. But what we can say is that we need to be very aggressive in pushing back against President Putin, whether that's in the form of sanctions, expulsion from the SWIFT banking system, certainly sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. All of these actions need to be put into place, as well as continuing to equip our Ukrainian friends with not only defensive capabilities, but also offensive weapons, just as Senator Coons had said. A number of these things have been discussed for months now, and this administration is only just acting on the suggestions that are coming from Congress. We simply need to let Putin know that the United States stands with our Ukrainian friends.
And what happens if they do invade, if the Russians invade? The sanctions are put in place. What does Putin do next? He hasn't ruled out missiles to Cuba, Venezuela. Should a NATO military response be on the table if Russia invades?
Well, first things first, and let's not put the cart ahead of the horse. We want to make sure that an invasion doesn't happen. And that's why I think diplomacy is very important at this point, but also showing a strong resolve from the United States of America. So far with this administration, we have seen a doctrine of appeasement, and that certainly is not going to deter President Putin and Russia from invading Ukraine. So let's make sure that we are pushing back right now with stiff sanctions, making sure that we are showing Putin we do mean business, but also making those preparations to pull out Americans that are in the most vulnerable area of Ukraine, which is that eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbas region. Let's make sure they are prepared to move out if necessary.
And Senator, I want to go back to my first question. It may be obvious to some, but I would like you to say why is this important to your constituents, to Americans?
Well, number one, we do need to fight for democracy and understanding that Putin's goal is to retain some of what he had during the Soviet era, that power and control, to expand his reaches across Europe. We know that if he's able to go into Ukraine and there's very little pushback from the United States or from NATO, it allows him to move into other countries in Eastern Europe. And we know that when Soviet Union expands as he wants to see it, it's, you know, a new form of the Soviet Union. As it expands, democracy will constrict. It is important that we step up for our allies in Europe. When democracy is stable, that means our troops, our citizens are much more safe. So this is a concern to our constituents. We need to make sure that democracy is prevailing around the globe and that socialism, communism, the old Soviet Union is not regaining territory.
And Senator, I want to move to voting rights. You heard that piece. I went down to Texas. You heard what the nonpartisan election official said. This is a canary in the coal mine for the midterms. Do you agree with that?
Well, every state will put in place its own voting systems, their election systems. That is a state's right. We should not be federalizing our election system as the Democrats had attempted to do. I am an expert when it comes to Iowa elections. I did serve as a commissioner of elections. And I can tell you even Iowa has been targeted by the left because they have changed their voter laws. But I will also say that even with those changes in our law, our voting election systems are much more liberal than President Joe Biden's home state of Delaware, as well as Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's home state of New York. So I think we need to look at the systems as a whole and support our voters. Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about Iowa and your state. According to the Brennan Center, which enacted laws at the 19 states which enacted laws that make it harder to vote. In Iowa, that includes significantly shortening the early voting period and closing voting sites an hour earlier. How do those changes make voting any more secure?
Well, it is the same level of security. What I would say is we still have 3 weeks of early voting before our elections day, which is far more liberal than the state of New York. So I would love to see the Brennan Center actually focus on New York. I think they only have 15 days of early voting. So it's still 3 weeks
why shorten
to
it?
go
Why
in
shorten what
and
you already
vote.
had?
Because when you do that, you are manning election centers. And in rural communities like mine, where it really does make sense, simply local governments can't afford to step out there, continue to man as they would during a smaller election season. But Martha, I will push back. Our right to vote is important. And individuals need to know and understand what those timeframes are. So shortening it by 7 days, 5 days, whatever it was, and allowing for that 3 weeks. It is still 3 weeks prior to an election, Martha. And so I would encourage all of those voters to get out. But again, my point is that we have Democrats that are targeting red states like Iowa, again, when our voter policies are far more liberal than blue states' voting systems. So the emphasis seems to be on red states, but not where there's actually the most restricting voting rules. So let's turn our attention to those states and make sure that those voters have the access necessary. I would also say, since we have put a number of the voting laws into place over the last several years, voter ID is one of those, we've actually seen voter participation increase, even in off-election years. So I think it's a false premise that the Democrats are promoting out there that this is restricting access, because in Iowa, we've only seen voters get out in higher numbers to participate in their very safe elections.
Okay, but we have the midterms ahead of us. But thank you very much for joining us this morning, Senator Ernst.
It's not going to be uniform throughout the country because we have different dynamics in different regions of the country. I would imagine as we get into February, into the middle of February, first few weeks of February, it is very likely that most of the states in the country will have turned around with their peak and are starting to come down with regard to cases and then obviously hospitalizations.
An optimistic note there about the Omicron surge as cases begin to fall nationally, offering a glimmer of hope that the highly infectious variant is beginning to recede. But with the country still averaging more than 700,000 new cases per day, what do the next few weeks hold? Joining us now live to discuss is the president's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci. It's good to see you again, Dr. Fauci. Really encouraging news in some places, New York, Chicago, here in D.C., may have reached their peak or are just about to reach their peak. But you said there that by mid-February, most states may reach a peak. Are you still confident about that?
You know, I think as confident as you can be. You never want to be overconfident when you're dealing with this virus, Martha, because it has certainly surprised us in the past. But if you look at the patterns that we've seen in South Africa, in the UK, and in Israel, and that, as you mentioned just a moment ago, in the Northeast and New England and upper Midwest states, they've peaked and starting to come down rather sharply. There are still some states in the southern states and western states that continue to go up. But if the pattern follows the trend that we're seeing in other places, such as the Northeast, I believe that you will start to see a turnaround throughout the entire country. Since it's a large country and a great deal of variation in the degree of vaccinations that we have in one region compared to another, ultimately they're all going to go in the same direction. There may be a bit more pain and suffering with hospitalizations in those areas of the country that have not been fully vaccinated or have not gotten boosters. But we do know, and these are the recent data that have come out from the CDC, that even with Omicron, boosting makes a major, major difference in protecting you from hospitalization and severe outcomes. So things are looking good. We don't want to get overconfident, but they all look like they're going in the right direction right now.
But then what should life look like? How do we stop going from surge to surge, from peak to peak, from variant to variant? What's the long-term strategy here?
Well, the long-term strategy, we hope, Martha, is that we will get to the point, particularly now with the turnaround of Omicron, which fundamentally looks like it is on a case-by-case basis less virulent in the sense of causing severe disease. It's by no means exempt from making people sick and putting them into the hospital, particularly those who are not vaccinated. However, what we would hope that as we get into the next weeks to month or so, we'll see throughout the entire country the level of infection get to below what I call that area of control. And there's a big bracket of control. Control means you're not eliminating it, you're not eradicating it, but it gets down to such a low level that it's essentially integrated into the general respiratory infections that we have learned to live with. I mean, we would like them not to be present, but they're there, but they don't disrupt society. They don't create a fear of severe outcomes that are broad. You will always get some severe outcomes with respiratory infections, even in a good pre-COVID era. You've always had that. We'd like it to get down to that level where it doesn't disrupt us in the sense of getting back to a degree of normality. That's the best case scenario. We've got to be prepared for the worst case scenario. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we have to be prepared, which is, I think, what you were alluding to a moment ago, that we get yet again another variant that has characteristics that would be problematic, like a high degree of transmissibility or a high degree of virulence. But again, the more people that we get vaccinated, the more people we get boosted, the supplies of therapies, which are going to be really important in preventing people from progressing to advanced disease, we're stocking up on that, getting many, many more tests in the form of what we've been talking about over the last week, 500 million tests coming out now and another 500 million very soon thereafter. If we have those things in place, vaccine, testing, masks, therapy, we could keep it at that low level. That would be the best case scenario.
Let's talk about the vaccines and the boosters. You have talked about how effective, especially the boosters are. Risk of severe illness reduced by as much as 94% with Delta, 84% with Omicron. What about the next booster shot? For a substantial part of the population, they're now moving into the 5th month of their booster. So does it lose its effectiveness, and how soon should they get another one, if that's your advice?
Well, the answer, Margaret, honestly, is that we don't know, because we don't know the durability of protection from the third shot boost of an mRNA and the second shot boost of a J&J. Certainly, you are going to see the antibody levels go down. That's natural. But there's an element of the immune response, B-cell memory and T-cell responses, where even though you do see a diminution of antibody levels, it is quite conceivable, and I hope it's true, that the third shot boost will give a much greater durability of protection. We're following that very carefully. And when I say protection, Martha, I mean protection against severe disease. You are going to see breakthrough infections, as we've seen now, even in boosted people. But for the very most part, they're mild or even asymptomatic. That's where we would like to be, is to have that where you don't have to get more and more always every 6 months with a booster. We may need to boost again. That's entirely conceivable. But before we make that decision about yet again another boost, we want to determine clearly what the durability of protection is of that regular boost, that third shot that we're talking about.
And Dr. Fauci, just quickly, I want to talk about children. Nearly 1 million children tested positive for COVID last week. Over 28 million eligible children are not vaccinated. There are some schools who are removing the mask mandate and leaving that up to parents. Are those kids safe? Is it safe to send your kids back to school without masks?
Well, Martha, as we know, the CDC strongly recommends that when you're in a situation in the school, we want to get the children back to school. And the way you do that, you do it by multiple things that you do. You surround the children with people who are vaccinated. For the children who are eligible to be vaccinated, get them vaccinated, and provide in the school masks where you can have children protected, as well as ventilation to make sure that you can get a respiratory infection at its lowest level of infectivity. All of those things go together, and masking is a part of that.
Okay, so good to see you this morning, Dr. Fauci. Thanks for joining us.